Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am delighted to be back with you after a little bit of a strange week last week. Happy to be with you on another Tuesday with another author interview. As we get started, I do want to remind you, as always, that I would love it if you would like, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you are either listening to or watching this episode on. You can also go to gsmcpodcast.info and leave a tip or a donation if you would like to support the podcast and the entire network in a different way. There's lots of ways to support the show. This is one of them. While you're there, you can leave a a question or a comment. I'm happy to engage with those. I'll make sure that I answer questions or engage with comments at the beginning of the next episode after receiving those questions or comments. Again, that link, if you want to leave a tip or a donation, is gsmcpodcast.info. Thank you, as always, for all of the support that you give the podcast, no matter what form that support takes. So how is your week going? How's your Tuesday going? We are now officially in September. I always like September. It's the beginning of fall, even though the weather doesn't always feel like it's the beginning of fall. Although we're having a beautiful, cool week so far, yesterday and today. High 70s with a really great breeze. It's just been gorgeous, so I cannot complain about that. We don't really have terribly defined seasons here, but at least there's a little bit of a difference in the weather right now, and it's feeling a little bit cooler. So after a couple of weeks there in August when it was pretty warm, it's nice to be enjoying this. Hope you had a good weekend. Mine was, I did an episode, as you may or may not know. Got to do an episode on a series of books that I have been reading and listening to, and I haven't done an episode like that for a while, so it was fun to get back to that. Love doing the author interviews, but it's been a while since I've done the other type of episode, so had fun doing that. And then hubby and I just hung out and spent time with the dogs and each other, trying to think if we did anything of note, and nothing is coming to mind, which is absolutely fine, because sometimes after the week I just need some downtime. Did go for a few walks, walk to the grocery store a couple times, so got to go hang out with our neighbor horse. I don't know if I've ever mentioned the horse that lives down the road from us, but it's a very sweet horse, lives just a little ways down. We see it whenever we walk to the grocery store or whenever we walk down that road, and he's a very sweet horse, and he recognizes us now, so he always comes running over, which, I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit of a dork, but it feels really good to be recognized by a horse who seems excited to see me when I walk down the road. It is what it is. I like it. He is a sweet horse. I have no idea what his name is. We should probably just give him a name to refer to him as instead of the horse, but so far we have not, and I don't know the person that owns the property. They're never there, so we've never had a conversation with someone to find out the name of the horse. But at any rate, we are not here to talk about my horsey neighbor friend. We are here to talk about Heather Frese's book, The Saddest Girl on the Beach. Heather is my guest for today, and the book, as I said, is called The Saddest Girl on the Beach. Let me give you the description of that book. Grieving her father's death, Charlotte McConnell seeks solace at the Outer Banks Inn, owned by her best friend's family, but she finds them dealing with their own family drama and soon lands in the center of an unexpected love triangle. Her hotel family welcomes Charlotte with chowder dinners and a cozy room, but her friend Evie has a looming life change of her own, and soon Charlotte seeks other attractions to navigate her grief. Will she, like in some television movie, find her way back through a romance, or are there larger forces at play on Hatteras Island? Heather Frese, winner of the Lee Smith Novel Prize and the author of The Baddest Girl on the Planet, sets Charlotte on a beautifully rendered course through human frailty and longing, unrelenting science, and the awesome forces of the Carolina coast. I like that last sentence the best. Human frailty and longing, unrelenting science, and the awesome forces of the Carolina coast. I just don't expect unrelenting science to be in a book book blurb, but I like it. You'll notice that this is the saddest girl on the beach, and referenced in that description was the baddest girl on the planet. They have the same characters in them, although they are set in different times. This one is set before the baddest girl on the planet, which is from Evie's perspective, Charlotte's friend Evie, and Heather is going to talk more about that. This is a book about a young woman dealing with grief and trying to figure out what it means to be 19 and having just lost her father at a very young age. Her father dies of cancer. She goes back to school because she promised him that she would, or she goes to school promising him that she would, but she is adrift. And when Evie calls her and asks and tells her that she is pregnant, this is not a spoiler, it happens at the very beginning of the book, you know right away, and Heather mentions this as well. Charlotte leaves school and goes to the inn to spend time with Evie, try to figure out what's going on there. She has a friendship, possibly more, with Charlotte's friend, or Evie's brother Nate, and then there's the complication of another boy, Michael, who is off limits, but there's something there. They're trying to figure that out. So there's a lot of trying to figure things out in this book, as is often the case when you're 19, even if you aren't dealing with something major like grief. So there's a lot of heavy topics in the book, and it is called The Saddest Girl on the Beach, but it has a lot of warmth and humor and lighthearted moments as well. We talk about that some in the interview. So this isn't going to be, this isn't a massive, like, you're just going to feel heavy and down when you read it. There are introspective moments, of course. There are moments of trying to navigate grief and what does your life look like now and all of those things for Charlotte. But again, there are lighthearted moments, there are very sweet moments, there's a lot of relational moments in this, because it is about it is about, at its center, relationships, Charlotte's relationship with her father, and what does that look like now that he's gone, and how does that change, and she's searching for some kind of deeper meaning there. Her relationship with her brother and her mother, who are still at home, and she is not. She would have been at school, but now she's here, and there's a lot of avoidance, even though she's not, like, she's still in contact with them, but there is some avoidance. Relationship with these two men who may or may not be something. She's not sure really what's going on with either of them. And then, of course, the relationship with Evie, and what does it mean to go and live with your best friend that you've never spent this much time with because of the way their childhood was and how they met. Lots and lots of relationships going on in this book. So really good from that relational standpoint, and how the characters move and grow through those relationships. So let's go ahead and turn now to the interview with Heather. Again, the book is called The Saddest Girl on the Beach. The author is Heather Frese. Hi, Heather, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'm excited to have you here to talk about The Saddest Girl on the Beach. Before we do that, before we start talking about the book, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, so I am an author, editor, teacher, and mom of 3 kids. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm from Ohio. That is my hometown.
All right. Where in Ohio, if I might ask?
Yeah, I'm from a small town in southeastern Ohio called Cambridge. So it's about an hour and a half east of Columbus.
Okay. My husband grew up in the Cleveland, Canton, Akron area. So
Yep, I was up there this summer. I did a whole little Ohio book tour this summer.
Nice.
Yeah,
Yeah,
got to go all
very
over
good. All right. So as I said, the book is called The Saddest Girl on the Beach, which is, it's a sad title. But not not like a sad book. It just deals with some topics. But go ahead and give an overview of the story.
Right. Yeah. So it does have some sadness in it. So the premise of the book is that Charlotte McConnell is 19 years old. Her father has just passed away. And she has sort of try to stuff that down and go away to school and pretend everything is okay. And after a couple of months of that, realizes that it's not. And at the same time, her best friend, Evie Austin, who lives on Hatteras Island, her parents own a small inn. Evie has just discovered that she is unexpectedly pregnant. So Charlotte takes that as a cue to leave school. She kind of goes down to the Outer Banks and stays at the inn with her friend Evie and her family. And that's kind of where the story starts. So Charlotte there on the beach, kind of really deep in this grieving process and trying to help her friend who is also in a very unexpected place in her life.
Yes. And she knows Evie's family because they spent summers as a family. So she not only has the support system of her friend Evie, but she's also got these very entrenched memories of summers with her parents, especially her dad, that she's trying to deal with all of those grief issues. Um, what was your initial inspiration or jumping off point for the story?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been writing these characters for a while, or at least thinking about these characters for a while. But so the initial jumping off point was that my father died. I mean, that part was autobiographical. I was a lot older and of course couldn't just like up and run off to the beach. But that's what I wanted to do. And so I kind of knew that I was ready to write about it when I started to imagine sort of the what ifs. And like, what if I happen to have a friend whose parents owned a little inn on the water? And what if they let me just come stay there? And what if I wasn't in my late 20s? What if I was only 19? What if I still wasn't really quite sure of who I was? And then trying to deal with the consequences of just losing this foundational person in my life. And then what if my best friend was going through this completely opposite experience, but nonetheless, kind of traumatic and life-changing, and kind of what would happen then. So that's kind of was the impetus. And a lot of it was me wanting to run away to the ocean and sort through all this stuff. But I also at some point kind of had the feeling that I wanted to turn it into fiction. Like I didn't want to write, you know, memoir or something. I wanted to write a story.
Sure, sure. Yeah, as I was reading it, my dad died 2.5 years ago. So
Oh,
also
sorry.
not 19, but I was doing kind of similar things. The what if, what if I had been only 19 and
Yeah,
how
exactly.
different would that have been than, almost 30 years later. I did kind of run away to the beach because we had just moved to Portugal.
Oh, wow.
We'd been here 3 weeks when I went home, and then I was home for 3 weeks, and then I did come back, and we live in a beach town. So,
Yeah, yeah. So you
but like Charlotte discovers, no matter where you are, there you are.
right,
So
exactly.
she's in this place that holds special memories, but she's still got to
Mhm.
figure out what now.
What now? Yeah, exactly.
Um, can you talk a little bit more about Charlotte and what about her might resonate with readers?
Yeah, well, I think I still kind of think of this as a coming of age story. Like I love a good coming of age story, like people characters in fiction trying to figure out who they are, trying to like come into themselves. And so partly I think this is that it's coming of age, but also it's just dealing with these hot topics, dealing with these feelings and emotions that arise from deep loss. As I was trying to figure out how to talk about this book, because it's more sad, right? It's not it's a different kind of a read than my previous novel. But what I keep coming up against is that almost everyone, I can't really think of anyone that hasn't experienced grief or loss or some emotion like that. It's part of life, and it's
Mhm.
like I think connecting with that and living with a character for a little while who's trying to process through those emotions is a connection point. And that's just kind of what I kept coming back to, is just this sense of connection and realizing that you're not alone feeling this way, because it feels like it. I mean, it feels like you're like really deeply alone when you're dealing with that kind of deep loss. So I think that's part of it. And then also on the flip side, I didn't want it to be a complete downer, right? Like I want it, there's humor. Like I think the characters are funny. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think personally, just when I was grieving or anytime, honestly, I'm at a hard point in my life. Humor is kind of always the saving grace. It's like, it's one of those if you don't laugh, you'll cry kind of things. Like you you have to um you have to take the absurd and the ridiculous along with the loss and the pain. Um because that's part of being human. And I think hanging on to that and having those twin sort of paired emotions will also be another thing that will connect.
Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah. And yeah, you mentioned humor. Anytime it does start to get a little heavy, then Evie's aunt shows up. And
Right.
her little dog, or there's
Yeah.
definitely lighthearted moments. I can only
Um,
imagine that was a fun character to write.
oh, she was so much fun. She's my favorite. And she's one of the ones I just like kind of made up. Like that's just my imagination. I'm just having some fun there. She's great.
I love it. I mentioned before that there is a lot of humor in this book, even when it feels dark or can maybe sad. And Evie's Aunt Faye and her little dog Walter are definitely a part of that humor. They, like I said, they had to have been a lot of fun to write because Aunt Faye is quite the character in many, many ways. But she's also good. She's that get a grip friend for Evie and Charlotte, the get a grip aunt, I guess, in this case. But we're going to go ahead and take our first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking about the connection between this book and the baddest girl on the planet. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Mm-hmm. 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 Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to work, cause my boss is a jerk, and I'm not even that paid. I need a change in my life, cause I don't feel alive, and there's nothing that makes me happy. Hold my beer for a minute, I'm about to quit my job, cash in for a ticket. I'm going on a trip and I don't plan to visit. I'm gonna stay there till I feel like I'm winning, and this is just the beginning. I need a big change, help me feel like living. I need a big swing, home runs I'm hitting, and I'll never look back, moving on till I get it all. And we all got dreams, we all want things, but what you gonna do for it? How you gonna move for it? What you gonna be? And do you believe you can do anything?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Heather Frese. As we begin segment 2, I do just want to remind you one more time that you can go to gsmcpodcast.info, leave a tip or a donation. It really does help out not just this podcast, but the entire network as a whole. Again, that link is gsmcpodcast.info. Before the break, we were talking about the story and that there are some heavy topics within this story, as I mentioned at the beginning, but that there are also moments of humor and lightheartedness. And, that's life, right? Even when things feel really dark and heavy, there are those light moments. And sometimes they feel great. Sometimes you think, ooh, that was odd timing, but they always happen, and they can be very, very welcome, and this book is an example of that. So let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Heather. This is a standalone novel, but it could also be considered a prequel to your previous novel. Is that correct? Because the previous novel is more about Evie, but Evie further in the future. Can you talk about the relationship between the stories?
Yeah. So they are companion novels. Each of them can stand alone. You can read each one and be completely fine. You don't need to know any other information. But read together, they do have the same characters, the same universe, the same setting. And this one, the newest one, Saddest Girl on the Beach, is Charlotte's experience, her point of view. And the baddest girl on the planet is Evie. her story and her voice. And it's definitely Evie's story goes more into the future. So in a way, this does sort of function as a prequel. But when I was thinking about, I was sort of talking about the coming of age portion of it. I wanted to focus on this part of Charlotte's life in depth and kind of like sink into this and structurally have it be just in this more contained time period. Whereas Evie's does go back and forth in time. It goes into the future. I wanted hers to end like in her 30s, kind of sorting out who she is a little bit more. But yes, you will definitely get a lot more of the backstory if you have read The Baddest Girl on the Planet first. You will be able to go back when they're young to a period of time in The Baddest Girl on the Planet that is sort of just alluded to, or maybe like a scene or two in that time period. So
how was that for you as the author to go back to, it's more Charlotte's story, but you've got that backstory a little bit with Evie. Was that fun? Was it challenging? How was it?
Yeah, it was definitely, I had to keep track of it. I definitely had like notebooks of like a timeline, because part of the book, both of them actually is anchored in this the move of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse in 1999. So for those people in the audience who might not be familiar with the area, so Cape Hatteras is a barrier island, and the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse is the tallest lighthouse in America, so 208 feet tall, I believe. And in the late 90s, it was really threatened by erosion. The beach was just getting eaten up right where the lighthouse was, like right there. And so the National Park Service decided to move it. So they just like sort of picked it up and put it on a little train track and scooted it 1.5 miles inland. And so now it kind of sits in the woods where it's not going to wash away in a hurricane. So I had that as sort of a touch point. But I had to remember, what age the characters were, what was going on, if I was going to use that as a touch point, because I didn't want to get that wrong. That kind of irks me about fiction is something wrong that is anchored in real life or a real life place or timeline. So I had to keep track of that. And then I also sort of had to just kind of figure out where they were in their personalities, and just lots and lots of what was happening when. So I had to keep track of all of that. But a funny aside here is that I actually wrote The Saddest Girl on the Beach first. I drafted it before I drafted The Baddest Girl on the Planet. So I wrote it over the course of a few years, relatively soon after my father had passed away. And I finished it, like I wrote a draft, but it needed revised, but I just could not make myself go back to it to revise it, and to take care of that part of the process. And so sort of in my messing around trying to get my head back in the game for The Saddest Girl on the Beach, I started drafting Evie's story because while I was writing Charlotte's, I saw Evie get married. I knew, that's not going to end well, based on the circumstances. And so I started to think, I was like, I wonder how she gets divorced from Steven, because I know it's going to happen. And so I started just like messing around with that and playing with it. And I started to write it from her point of view. And it was really fun. Could just do that first person switch from one character to the other, because they're very different. They're very different characters, almost opposite, but with a core connection that is similar. But so yeah, I started to write Evie's story, and that one just sort of took off on its own volition, and I ended up putting the first one away for a while and focusing on Evie and writing it, and I could revise it. It was funny, like it wasn't the sort of emotional material that this book is. And so that's the one that got published first. Like that's the one that I had ready to go, and got it out into the world. And then At some point a few years ago, I finally was able to go back and revise The Saddest Girl on the Beach and kind of look at it with a little more objectivity, um,
Mm,
and a little more eye to what needed to happen, plot-wise, what needed to happen with the pacing, what needed to happen with all these craft elements that were
yeah,
separate from the emotional core of it, and that I could finally have enough distance on to think
right.
about that.
Yeah. Well, and it's the coming of age story for Charlotte because she is dealing with working through grief and what this means for her and what direction her life is going to take. But it's also interesting from a friendship point of view because Charlotte and Evie have known each other since they were like around 10 or younger children, friends
Yeah.
during the summer. And
Mhm.
now they've come together, they're living in
Right.
the same place, they're adult-ish,
Right. Yeah.
they're 19, they're adults, but and that's a completely different, like, how do you navigate that relationship? So you've also got a coming of age story with their relationship, and it gets
Yeah.
rocky.
It's Rocky. Yeah. Yeah. The friendship story has always been really central to me. Like there's lots of different romances and stuff like that in both of the stories. Both of the books have romantic elements that form like part of the character's growth. But for me, like the biggest one has always been their friendship. I think that's the most interesting, it's the
Yeah.
funniest. And yeah, just the idea of you're really good friends with this person in the summer when you come to visit, and they stay in touch with letters and they call each other and they stay really good friends. But yeah, for the first time now they're together all the time. Charlotte is out of her comfort zone and in this world that isn't hers,
Yeah.
that Evie is familiar with. And like I said in the beginning, like they're in these drastically different points of change in their lives. So it's going to cause a lot of conflict in their relationship, which I thought was interesting to explore in fiction.
Yeah. As well as Charlotte moving to the place where she spends summers. So, a little bit of your summer when you're a tourist, and then
Yes,
being a year-round resident, totally different
totally different
experience.
experience.
Yeah.
Totally different dynamic
Abs
to be there and just like living, just like for her to get to see what it's like in the winter. Like she's never been there in the winter, and it's
yeah.
completely different. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. There's another relationship with a character named Michael, and Charlotte and Michael communicate via text by quoting each other lines from How to Read a North Carolina Beach.
Right.
Just give me the backstory on how that came to be.
Right. So this was one of those recent revision elements where I finally was able to go back into the book, and I realized I needed to have more of a sense of what was connecting these characters, because Michael in the story is kind of forbidden fruit. He is not available romantically, and yet they have this connection that they're kind of forming through science. I think the way this intertwines with the grief story is that Charlotte experiences this a fairly big crisis of faith when her father passes away, and just sort of this feeling of loss of anything of a more spiritual nature. And her Charlotte's dad was a geologist. Like he tended to talk more about, atoms and electrons than scriptures. And so this feeling of loss that she's trying to sort out of things of a spiritual element, she's kind of going back to science, and this is what she's kind of leaning on. And Michael is a scientist, and he is down there researching currents or something in the ocean. And so when Charlotte finds this book, it's one that Michael is familiar with, and it is it's a scientific text. But when I was reading it, I just happened to come across, my neighbor gave me a copy. And as I was reading it, it was like so poetically written. The way the science was written was so rhythmic and interesting, and it also had such fascinating connotations to me. Like this idea of like the swash zone, like in between things currents wash back and forth and things are not stable and solid. Like it's a scientific principle, like this something that happens, you know, in the world, particularly in the world on the Outer Banks. But as my character is reading it, as I was reading it, I of course like thinking about her emotional state and how she's connecting the science to that, and just the idea of having Charlotte and Michael use this book, this scientific text, to connect with both the science aspect and the emotional aspect, and pulling that together, using this other text was just kind of interesting to me. And so that's kind of how I started having them flirt, and how I started having them, you know, how she started forming this attachment to him, through an understanding, of both science and emotion.
Yeah. It was one of the more interesting beginnings of a flirting text relationship. So it had to have been fun to just kind of, once you got the idea, to start going through and deciding what quotes to use, what would be appropriate.
Yeah, it was really fun. Like, what are they like? What's she feeling right now? What is he going to? What is he going to be pulling out? Where are they going to be in the book? And just like writing them down. And like the more, like I would just type them out. I just typed out a list of like the quotes that I thought were particularly resonant, and there were so many of them. It's so interesting to me how this just truly, I mean, it was truly a scientific book. Like they weren't trying to, you know, write about a character and her emotions, but the way that it tied together was just really interesting and really fun.
Yeah. So obviously that was a piece of the research that you did, because you read the book and you found quotes, and it deals with scientific elements in the book. But were there other types of research that you needed to do for the story?
Yeah, I'm always big on having trying to get my moon in the right part of the sky. As one of my writing professors used to say, just having those details correct, that are pulled from the real world, or like I said, like the timeline of the lighthouse move. I always wanted to have that correct, and even smaller research elements like, you know, would this grocery store be open in January? And so I would like pull up a bunch of tabs and like research what is open when, where are they going to be going? So a lot of stuff like that, in relation to the setting. And then so the setting, the timeline, kind of keeping track of the characters' emotional arcs, required, like, you know, logging that stuff. But I definitely researched the place. I researched a lot of the history of the Outer Banks, because it's so fascinating. And this was another sort of revision edition part of it, because Charlotte has this affinity with language. Charlotte is kind of fascinated with the stories of the place. And so pulling that in, like the names of the lighthouse keepers, the stories of like the British cemetery on Ocracoke Island, the torpedoes in World War II. And a lot of this was stories I had grown up with. I had grown up, like Charlotte, I'd grown up going on vacation to the Outer Banks, and I would just read everything, and read all the little newspapers and stuff over breakfast. So I was always kind of had the stories of the area swirling around in my brain, but I definitely researched them before I included it in the book, because I wanted to get that right. So a lot of the history, a lot of the ecology, I wanted to get right. And then because the scientific element is kind of a thread that pulls through the book, I researched that a little bit more too. Like she goes into like, I don't know, astrophysics a little bit, and like atom, like I don't know, electrons and yeah, no. But I was like, my kid was reading this book about astrophysics. You know, it's just like Neil deGrasse Tyson, like he was interested in black holes at the moment or something like that. So I would research that, and wanted to get those details as correct as I could. And I don't pretend to be a, you know, astrophysicist, but I wanted to get them at least mostly right.
Yeah. As much as possible, yeah. I think that I would obsess over research regardless, but I think that I would definitely worry about researching anything science-based because, I mean, I like science. I'm okay in science. It wasn't my greatest subject in school, although I got good grades in it, but that doesn't mean I can explain astrophysics to you. Or certain aspects of geology or lots of the other things that are talked about in terms of the science of this book. So good job to Heather for researching and it seemed accurate to me, but again, not a scientist, so cannot completely vouch for that, but glad that she was the one doing the research. We're going to pick this conversation back up when we come back from the break. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Heather Frese. Before the break, we were talking about research and astrophysics, and I mean, that's not the only thing we were talking about, but lots of other things in terms of research and science and researching science. And I just wanted to remind you of that so you remembered where we were in the conversation before we pick it back up with segment 3. Slight tangent, but it just reminds me that my great nephew was born in February, and my mom bought him a series of board books that are like science for babies. They're literal board books, like rocket science for babies. And so she keeps joking.
That kind of stuff.
She keeps joking that he needs to have his PhD by the time he's 2. I love that they make board books for science board books for babies.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I know one of the things my dad read to me, that's like one of my core memories, is he checking out a book from the library about sound and like decibels and how sound waves worked, and he would always say, lower your decibels when we were too loud.
Nice.
I love that. I love just having the science of the world worked into our everyday existence.
Exactly. Yeah, because it does. I mean, whether we recognize it or not.
Mhm.
So you wrote this story first, and
Mhm.
then revised a lot. So in terms of character development, especially Charlotte as the main character, but did the characters themselves change a lot during that process, or did you have a really good sketch of them beforehand? How was that?
Right. I felt like I had a fairly good sketch of Charlotte and the time period that I was setting this book in, and the arc that I wanted her to have in that time period for the Saddest Girl on the beach. Evie was just a surprise, and she was fun, and she constantly shifted, and her sort of arc and trajectory and what was influencing her changed as I was writing her book. It was a whole different process for both of these books. Just as the characters are really different, the whole process was different, and the storyline was different for each of them. So yeah, Charlotte was a little more, kind of had a grasp on what I wanted to happen there.
Yeah.
He was a surprise.
Yeah. So two standalone but connected books set in the same universe. Are you done with these characters? Do you think you'll revisit this world?
Yeah, so I thought I was done. I thought I wanted these two there. I mean, they're two best friends, or I wanted one for each of them, and then I was going to move on to other things. And then I realized that I'm not done with them. And as I was working through a couple of ideas, I realized that I think there's one more to tie it together. And I want to take them out of their late teens and into their, mid 40s and see what happens. See what happens when they are grown-ups and see what happens when they're having their sort of second coming of age. Um, and see what happens when maybe they live together again, like after, going off and living their lives in these separate paths, very separate paths,
Yeah.
in some ways. So I think I'm not quite done with them yet. I think there's one more book in the works with these characters and in this universe.
Okay. Well, that's
Yeah.
the fun thing I think about, we think of coming of age stories often as young adult novels and around that age, but we're all, I mean, I don't know, I'm sure I've come of age 10 times in my life, just as various things happen.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
like the bringing them into their 40s or, kind of exploring what happens later.
Yeah, explore what happens later. And I don't think the growth stops. Yeah, I don't think you just come
Right.
of age and, like that's that. And particularly for women, and particularly for just thinking about becoming comfortable with who you are. It doesn't, I don't think it even begins to start at 19, I
Yeah.
think, and then moving that forward into like how you parent and how you deal with your parents declining and this different state that you're in, and how things shift and how you figure that part out. And again, I think it'd be interesting to have them be in the same place, because have these different characters colliding again. I think that might be a common thread.
Yeah. I like it. Is that what you're working on now? Or are you working on a different project? What's the current WIP?
Right. So yeah, that's what I'm working on now. It's going kind of slowly because of the rest of life. So that's the big project I'm holding in my head at the moment, and then I'm trying to like work on. But then I do have a short story coming out in an anthology in October. So this is um an updated version of some of the ghost stories of North Carolina, which North Carolina has this really rich history of tall tales and ghost stories. And so an anthology that's being put together is taking some of those stories that didn't maybe necessarily hold up terribly well with either their language or their plot or the pacing. Anyway, just kind of going back to those and updating them. And so I have a story about Blackbeard the pirate. So I got Ocracoke. So I'm super excited about that. So that will come out in October around Halloween. So
Perfect timing.
yeah, perfect timing.
What's the name of the anthology?
I think it's a working title right now, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
But I'm thinking something like Ghosts of the Old North State, I think was the working title, but that might change. So don't quote me on that one.
Okay. Good to know. And then any other writings that you want to highlight since we have the space?
I just wrote some pieces in connection with the release of this book. So those are the sort of my most recent ones. I have an essay on the Daily Beast about the houses in Rodanthe, which is a small town on the Outer Banks, a little bit further north from where these stories take place, but still on Hatteras Island. And these houses are just literally falling into the ocean and washing away. There's been, I think when I wrote the article this spring, there had been, I forget the number of the string of them, but since I published the article, I believe that 3 more have fallen
Oh, wow.
into the ocean. So it's sort of an article on climate change, about the communal sense of grief of that, and what we do with that, how we deal with that kind of huge problem, and how it's impacting the setting, the coastline of North Carolina. So that was one of my favorite ones that I wrote. And then I have a piece up in Writer's Digest and a couple other places that were more recent. And then, yeah, just working on the Blackbeard and working on the new book. Those are my main ones. But I think that's what's the most recent.
Okay, thank you. Is writing something that you've always wanted to do? Did you always know you wanted to write for publication, or you wanted to write in other ways? What was that process for you?
Yeah, it was kind of one of those things that was always part of who I was. Like I started reading. Reading came naturally and easily, and writing was always something that I was doing. Just as kind of part of being me, I guess. And so I always had stories in my head. I always had dialogue going on in my head. Always had books going. So that was always a huge part of my life. But then sort of realizing the publication piece of it and if I could do it professionally was a different part of the journey, because for a long time I didn't think it was something that was doable, you know? And so when I went to college, I majored in elementary education for a long time and minored in English. And then at some point after I student taught a classroom of kindergarteners, I was like, we're gonna we're gonna shift this. So I gear shifted to straight up English, and then I decided to see if I could get into grad school. So to study creative writing more in depth. And so I did that. I got in, did it once, and then I decided to go get my MFA. So at that point, it was just kind of going all in to see what I could do and to see if, you know, teaching writing and publishing writing was kind of viable as a path. Because I wasn't going to be a kindergarten teacher. I love them. I love kindergarteners.
But
Ooh,
20 years is a lot different energy than
a lot different energy. Like, bless the kindergarten teachers. Like I couldn't do it. Wasn't gonna be me.
If there was only some way we could take that energy and bottle it and then give it to the teachers so they had equal amounts of energy.
Right. Yeah. So much energy.
I used to work with preschoolers. I wasn't a full-time teacher. I only had them like once a week as part of another job I was doing, and for like 20 minutes. And you know, that was so much fun, but it's seriously like herding cats, like just, and I had their teachers in the room with me, but there's no control. That you never know where that conversation is going to go.
Oh my God. They're so funny. They're so funny. But yeah, the energy to like herd those cats was just astonishing.
I just remember one little kid, he just out of the blue says to me, you know, when you drink the water, it makes you have to pee. And I was like, that is accurate, but I don't know what that has to do with anything.
Like, that's true. That is true.
Right? Science, you know?
Science, right? See, every day, every part of our lives. Right?
Exactly. When you take time to read just for you, not necessarily for research or anything, go to authors and genres.
Oh, so genre-wise, I'm pretty much literary fiction. I've kind of, part of the hazard of going to graduate school to study writing is that you can't shut off your brain. So I'm constantly thinking about the elements that are going into it. So I mean, I do still love People magazine. Like, I love trashy magazines, and I love creative nonfiction. I love memoir. That's kind of my subgenre. So I love that, but mostly I read literary fiction. That's my passion and where my heart is. As far as authors go, man, I'm just looking at my to be read shelf up there. I have Jill McCorkle, I have Julia Alvarez, I have Crying in H Mart, Michelle Zauner. Those are some of the ones I'm hoping to get to or finish pretty soon, or that are in progress. So yeah, mostly literary fiction, memoir, and trashy magazines. That kind of encapsulates me.
You gotta have a variety, right?
I have a variety.
Sometimes your brain needs a break. How about your kiddos? Anything that they're reading right now that's fun?
Oh yeah, my daughter's starting Wonder. God, I'm blanking on the author, but the book is Wonder, and it's so good because well, first of all, it's such an amazing story. It's very well written, and it does the multiple first person point of view, which I adore. And that's actually what I'm attempting for this next book, is to do multiple first person.
Sure.
Because it's something I love to read, and I've never successfully pulled it off myself. So I'm like, now's the time, we're gonna do this. I'm gonna see if I can do it. So yeah, she's reading Wonder. I think my oldest is going to start oh, what is it? It's like those, they're Olympians. It's like a fantasy. Do you know what I mean? It's
The like the Percy Jackson
yeah,
series?
yeah, Percy Jackson. That's it.
okay.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, Percy Jackson. He's starting Percy Jackson. We read a lot of Stacey McAnulty over the summer because she visited their school and she was fantastic. And my little guy, he's into the Magic Tree House right now. And he's actually, so my oldest was interested in the black holes and the dark matter and that stuff a few years ago. And now my little one, he wants to know how the Earth was made. And he wants to know the timeline, and he wants to know what happened with the dinosaurs. And he still is very insistent that the asteroid that took out the dinosaurs is what made the continent split apart. And I keep trying to get that timeline right in his head. I'm like, I don't think so, Jordy. I think like it
good for him for like trying to piece it together
he's
and
trying to
figure
piece it
out,
together.
like that's amazing.
He's my experimental. He just wants to do science experiments. He's into that kind of thing. So I started him on the astrophysics for young people in a hurry the other day. But he was kind of like, can we get to the part where the Earth is made? Because that's
right. It's still great, but I need to know.
It's all great, but
yeah. Yeah.
Like, it all ties together. You got to know all of it.
Exactly. I love how that kid's brain works. I have never met him. I probably never will meet him, but I just love the way he thinks through things and wants to know the answer to things. And I don't know that I would have, no, I do know that I would never have come up with those questions at that young of an age. But I probably had lots of questions about other topics, but no, not about dinosaurs and science and Pangea and everything else. So kudos, kid. I applaud you. Let's go ahead and take our final break of this episode. When we come back, Heather will be giving her advice for anyone who would like to potentially write, especially in her case, literary fiction. You're tuned into the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Heather Frese. Before the break, we were talking about what Heather likes to read in her spare time, and then in my usual wanting to know what everyone is reading, including the children of the authors I speak to, we talked about what her kids have been reading and some really fun choices there. So let's go ahead and finish up this conversation with Heather. I missed a step in our questions. I meant to ask you advice for aspiring authors from your own experience.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I think the first foundational thing is that you just have to read. You have to read everything. I'm like, I by no means grew up reading literary fiction and literary works, like, but I loved Babysitter's Club and I loved Sweet Valley High and I loved Christopher Pike and I loved, uh, you know, the V.C. Andrews Gothic novels and
It's
Stephen
amazing
King.
we grew up with any sense of normalcy, the things we read as kids.
Things we read, geez.
Yeah.
Like I think about letting my kids read that now, and like, I mean, go do it because like I
Right,
love that.
right.
But
Yeah, I got to read whatever I wanted and I turned out okay, but sometimes I'm like,
okay. I know. Like, what did we read? What were we reading? But yeah, so just reading all of that, and then that's the first piece of advice. And then writing it, like get some good books about craft, because I think a lot of the interesting thing about creative writing is that it is this interesting process where part of it is the art and the inspiration and the just the creativity and the stepping out of your own head and letting things go forward and getting things on the page. And then the other part of it is this more logical, more learned process where you can learn about dialogue, you can learn about pacing, you can learn about description, you can learn about even I would say study poetry. Like I love studying poetry and teaching poetry. I'm not a poet. I'm not that great at writing poetry, but the attention to sound and the attention to the line, the attention to just the language, is something that you can learn and something that will inform everything that you do, writing wise. So those two parts of it, I think, are important for an aspiring writer to be aware of. And then the other component, I think, is learning about the process, that it is this process. Like you don't just think something up and it goes on the page. And part of that is finding a community. Finding a writing community is really big. Whether you get that through an MFA or whether you get that through courses or conferences or a writing group. Our local libraries have lots of good resources for that, and you can find a writing group and you share your drafts and they give you feedback, and kind of learning that process is important because you kind of learn. So through learning what feedback to take to heart and what feedback to discard kind of helps you, or helped me, figure out what was important to me and what I wanted to do in the book, or the story or whatever I was working on. So I think that's a big part of it. So there's lots of resources out there. So just like reading, writing, practicing, and finding a community, I think, are the biggest things.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. If people want to learn more about you and your books, share your website and any social media that you're active on.
Yeah. So my website is just heatherfrese.com. So my last name is spelled Frese. So heatherfrese.com. And then I am active on Instagram and Facebook and Threads. All of those are Heather K Frese. So just sticking a little K in the middle there. For most of the social media. And I don't think I'm really active on Twitter, X, whatever. I used to try to do it and it's not my favorite platform. So I just let that one go. But you can find me on Instagram and Facebook. Those are kind of my go-tos.
All right. Any newsletters or anything if people go to your website?
Yeah. I have a newsletter I started up recently. Oh, I actually need to update that because it is almost September. So thank you for that. I need to do that, Lord. Okay, but yes, I have a newsletter. I would love for people to sign up so they can see where I am and where I'm doing. I'm going to be. I did a lot of book touring in Ohio this summer and on the Outer Banks, and I'm going to be in a couple places along the coast in the fall. So yeah, the newsletter will keep you updated on all of that and the anthology and things that are coming up and what's going on. So yeah, you can find that on the website.
Perfect. Thank you. Heather, is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure you highlighted?
I think you did a really good job. I'm happy. I think we're good.
Good. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your weekend to talk to me about both books, but especially Saddest Girl on the Beach. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much to Heather for joining me to talk about the Saddest Girl on the Beach and a little bit about the Baddest Girl on the Planet. And you just saw my girl walking around back there. She made her appearance. So thank you once again to Heather for joining me. If you're a fan of literary fiction, if you're a fan of coming of age stories and stories that really rely heavily on character arcs and character growth through relationships and how those relationships function, then you definitely want to check out The Saddest Girl on the Beach. And a nice thing is that there are 2 books. It's kind of a series, but you can read them in either order. I happen to read this one first, and it is the first chronologically, but I think that you can definitely read them in either order. But either way, there are 2 books, which is always fun when you find a new book, but then there are 2. So definitely check these out. And then Heather did say she's working on a 3rd, so I am looking forward to that, especially to see how Charlotte and Evie's relationship evolves. I have not read Baddest Girl on the Planet yet, but it's on my TBR because I want to hear Evie's story. It was interesting to get to know her younger self, her 19-year-old self in this book, and to know that the next one takes place a little further in the future, and to see some of the consequences of things that happen in this book, and to see how her life has changed or not changed, how she has changed as a character, etc. So definitely looking forward to that when I finally get to it on my TBR. Sorry, there's a bug on my wall, it just distracted me. It happens, but thank you so much to Heather for joining me. Thank you as always to you for joining me. I hope you'll join me for the next episode. We are switching gears and going to nonfiction next week. I will be speaking with author Kelly Florence. She's actually a co-author. She and her co-authors wrote Travels of Terror, Strange and Spooky Spots Across America. Yes, I can read. Travels of Terror, Strange and Spooky Spots Across America. Apparently it's a tongue twister for me. So they are fans of horror and just kind of all things horror and spooky and Halloween, and they did road trips together. And this is a travel book, but with a twist. It's, places that you can go where they do ghost tours or where something, maybe true crime happened. They stay in the Lizzie Borden house. They visit Salem. They give tips on where to eat and where to stay, etc. So it's a twist on a travel book, and if that's something that you never thought of or maybe have thought of and want to do spooky road trips, then you'll definitely want to join me for this conversation with Kelly on the next episode. In the meantime, if you are a fan of this episode and you have not done so already, please do like, follow, and subscribe, whatever platform you are either listening to or watching this episode on. Said it at the beginning, say it every week. It really does help the algorithm. Also, leaving a review is incredibly helpful. Doesn't have to be complicated. Don't overthink it. I'm projecting because I would overthink it, but you don't have to overthink it. It can be really simple. And it, again, really helps the algorithm, gets this podcast out to more readers such as yourselves, and it is greatly appreciated. All of your support is always greatly appreciated. And again, if you are on social media and want to follow the podcast on social media, you can do so on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. Another place that you can find the podcast, find me, and ask questions. Tell me what you're reading. Tell me if you've read any of the books by the authors that I've interviewed. Tell me what you're putting on your TBR. Maybe, just in general, but hopefully some of the authors I've interviewed have inspired you to add books to your TBR. Come help me fulfill all of my burning questions that I have. Come find me on social media. We'll find the podcast on social media and by extension me. I hope you're having a great week so far. Hope you're having a great September so far. And whatever is going on, we're getting closer to sweater weather depending on where you live. But whatever your weather, whatever your sweater or lack of sweater is, I hope the week is giving you plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
Let's go. I I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to